Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Earl.
And I'm Will Garcia.
And together we're the Hoops Guys. And today we're going to continue our 2014-2015 NBA season previews by talking about the Atlanta Hawks, as denoted by that custom-made number 58
Nice.
Marty Blake jersey behind me.
Absolutely. And there were a lot of good things for this team this year. Yeah, there was a significant injury. We'll touch more on that later. Yeah, the regular season record was a bit mediocre, finishing only 38-44. Yeah, they only got the 8th seed. But the Hawks pushed the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, of course the Indiana Pacers, to a 7-game series that I think the Hawks probably should have won. They were up 3-2 for a little while there. A couple of those games they lost were, I think one was 3 points. They absolutely had the opportunity to advance despite those sorts of setbacks.
Well, I mean, factor in that they were missing arguably their best player, and their ability to push the number 1 seed in the East to 7 games and have a decent shot at winning that is pretty impressive. And they were able to do that in part because they shot really well.
Absolutely.
They finished 9th in the league in effective field goal percentage, which isn't surprising as they had a tendency to take really high-value shots. They ended up 9th in expected points per shot, which is a great stat from Ian Levy over at Nylon Calculus that measures the value of your shot selection.
Yeah.
And on top of it, they converted those shots very well, winding up 9th in actual points per shot. Mm-hmm. They were really aggressive and successful in the paint, finishing 6th at in-the-paint true shot attempts and 7th in field goal percentage there. They took the 5th lowest number of mid-range shots, but they hit the ones that they did take, finishing 9th in field goal percentage from mid-range. They really valued the three-pointer, which was evidenced by them ranking 2nd in corner 3 true shot attempts and 15th in field goal percentage from there. Mm-hmm. And they ranked 3rd in above the break 3-point shot attempts and also 15th in percentage. So they didn't convert the threes overly well, but they took a lot of them.
Yep.
And on top of it, they converted very well at the most valuable shot in the league, the free throw line, finishing 6th in free throw percentage.
Yeah, and defensively, it's not like they were slouches. They didn't give up that many looks in the paint, finishing 9th in true shooting attempts in that area. They forced the 9th most mid-range shots, held opponents to the 8th fewest above the break 3, or the 8th lowest above the break 3-pointer percentage, and they didn't foul.
Nope.
They didn't give teams that many of the most valuable shot in basketball, like we mentioned, the free throw. And they finished 8th in free throws per field goal attempt on defense. And they forced turnovers pretty well as well, finishing 8th in turnover percentage on defense.
Yeah, not everything went well for the Hawks over this past year. Now, some of this is off-court stuff.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about racism.
Yeah, so in September, the Atlanta Hawks majority owner, Bruce Levinson, stepped down after self-reporting to the NBA that he had sent an internal Hawks email that was, in his terms, inappropriate and offensive, and in most people's terms, racist, regarding the makeup of the Hawks fan base. He's now looking to sell the controlling interest of the team.
Yeah, and that wasn't the only incident that happened. You have Danny Ferry reportedly reading verbatim off of a pretty racist scouting report about Luol Deng, saying that he has, quote, a bit of African in him, and then mentioning somehow that means that he sells counterfeit goods in his store. That's pretty screwed up, and everyone seemed to think that was pretty screwed up. So now Ferry is on an indefinite leave of absence, as he should be, and that leaves Mike Budenholzer, the head coach, acting as the interim GM on top of his coaching responsibilities, kind of filling that Doc Rivers role right now.
Which is not an easy role, especially during the season when coaching takes up a lot of time.
Yeah.
But ultimately, beyond the negativity that arises from these racist comments, Yeah, it also means a lot of uncertainty for this Hawks organization right now. It likely means that within the next year, the Hawks are going to have a new majority owner. Could be an entirely new ownership group.
Yeah.
A couple of former players, Dikembe Mutombo, Dominique Wilkins, and even Chris Webber are all trying to get their own groups together to make a bid on the franchise. And on top of that, there's going to be a new GM within the next year. No question.
Yeah.
And a new owner and GM combo. I try not to say absolutes like always or never, but almost always a new owner and GM combo means a significant change or two. Because that's just how it happens. They want to put their stamp on the franchise and wanted to do their take on it.
Yep.
So lots of uncertainty hanging over this franchise right now.
Yeah. One thing that was a bit more certain was that Al Horford didn't play that many games last year.
Nope.
On December 26th of 2013, Al Horford was diagnosed torn right pectoral muscle. Yeah, it sounds
terrible.
Sounds about as it's as bad as it sounds.
Yes.
In the 29 games he did play, the Hawks basically balled out, going 16-13, third in the East. 16-13 is balling out in the East, okay? And then in the 53 games he missed, they went 22-31, which is not awesome. So this team needs Big Al, other Big Al.
Yeah, and on the court, there were some things that the Hawks didn't do that well either. Offensively, they didn't really generate additional possessions through the offensive glass. They finished 28th in offensive rebound rate.
Yep.
And they also really struggled at protecting the ball, finishing tied for 26th in turnover rate, part of which is systemic because they were implementing more of a Spursian type offensive system with a lot of ball and player movement, but still, yeah.
Yeah, that's what happens when you try to be Spurs East. But anyway, opponents also shot well from the paint, mid-range, and the corners against the Hawks, with the Hawks finishing 28th in the paint defensive field goal percentage, 25th in mid-range defensive field goal percentage, and 28th again in corner three-point percentage defensively.
Yeah, and despite these problems, there is some really interesting talent on this team. They have a really good core. Most specifically, the guy we've mentioned a couple of times already, Al Horford.
Yeah.
He's one of the most well-rounded and overall best bigs in the entire NBA.
Yeah.
There aren't many bigs skilled enough to be able to score efficiently in the post.
Yeah.
As the roll man, either diving to the rim or popping for the J. Off ball as a savvy cutter. Not many bigs are able to be a knockdown, catch and shoot guy from mid-range, as well as run the floor and finish well in transition. So offensively, that's a crazy broad skill set. Throw in the fact that he's a good on-ball and team defender, and he's pretty darn good at Windexing that defensive glass.
Yeah.
And there simply aren't that many players like him. He might be fairly underrated by casual fans, but those in the know love Al Horford.
Yeah, and another guy that if you're in the know you have to love is Paul Millsap.
Yes.
Totally under the radar, but he was the primary scoring threat for the Hawks this past season, and the one cool thing that he developed was an improved ability to shoot from the three-point line. Either he improved it or he was already good at it, and the Hawks just let him do it more. I don't know, but either way, him shooting threes worked well. A lot more attempts, 3 attempts per game, 36%, which is pretty solid for a stretch big.
Especially league average on 3 attempts a game for a big is
probably
really impressive.
Contested pretty solidly, yeah. He can also rebound, pass, score from the mid-range, score from the post, play good team defense, play good man defense, play good post defense. Guard some threes, guard some fours. Guard most fours, guard pretty much every four. He can do pretty much everything on that basketball court other than being an elite rim protector kind of guy. But even then, he's not like a sieve at that either.
No.
So considering all of this, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that he put up career highs in points and assists per 36, and that his steals, blocks, and fouls were all considerably better than his career averages. Plus, the guy put up 18, 8, 3, 1.5 steals and a block on solid 46, 36, 73, 55% true shooting splits. Then yeah, he's going to be an all-star, and he was an all-star.
Yeah. One guy who wasn't an all-star, but Will and I think he should have been, is Kyle Korver. He is simply the deadliest off-ball threat in the entire league. His every movement on the court is something the defense has to be focused on, because if he gets the ball with just a sliver of space, he will scorch the net like an aware Skynet would scorch the earth. While he's off maligned defensively, he's actually a very savvy team defender who fills his role and his responsibilities defensively in this Hawks defensive system very well. He probably should call up Meta World Peace to find out how to go about changing his name to Timberpedic due to how slept on this guy is as one of the most elite offensive forces in the entire NBA. Everyone views him as just an off-ball, catch-and-shoot role player. Kyle Korver is one of the toughest, most impactful offensive players in the entire NBA. I'm putting him up there with LeBron, KD, Dirk, Steph, all those guys. Korver has that type of impact offensively.
Absolutely. Another guy who has an impact offensively also wasn't an all-star, but I'd say he's a ramen noodle all-star.
Yeah.
DeMarre Carroll.
Yeah.
He's even more slept on than Kyle Korver is. To be fair, he's not really quite as good as Korver, but he's still like super slept on compared to the quality of his production. He improved his shooting significantly last year, coming up to 36% on three-pointers from 29% the year prior. A lot of that is just statistical noise, probably, and then a good deal of it is going from Tyrone Corbin to the Hawks.
And it's going to likely more
better looks.
Open looks, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he more than earned his playing time with his rock-solid perimeter defense. I love what the Hawks did here. It's something that I fully recommend that teams do, for whatever my recommendation is worth. They took a guy from a bench who had the skill set that they wanted, paid him way under what he's basically going to be worth, and they made him a starter. That's a really good way to go about things. That's how you wind up with Omer Asik. That's how you can wind up with Marcin Gortat. There are so many players who have come up from benches on other teams because they had the right skill set that you were looking for. Fun fact on DeMarre, it's not much of a coincidence that 12 of the top 13 lineups in terms of plus-minus have DeMarre in them for the Hawks.
Yeah, and then rounding out their core is Jeff Teague. One of the best dribble penetrators in the entire league. This is shown by the fact that he generated 16.6 points per game for himself and his teammates off of the second most drives in the league last year. And last season was kind of a career one offensively for Teague. He posted career best in points per 36, free throw attempts per game, and usage rate. He's really foundational to what Coach Bud is trying to do with this Spurs East offensive philosophy. His ability to break down the D off the bounce just fits so well with all the quality shooters in that offensive system.
Yeah. A major addition for this team, who will also hopefully fit into the offensive system, is Thabo Sefolosha. Commonly thought of as a 3-and-D guy, there wasn't much of a 3 last year with Thabo. He only shot 32% from there. Having said that, a large portion of that is because that OKC offense gets a bit stagnant.
Yeah.
So it makes it difficult to necessarily get the most open looks, even if you're playing with guys like Russ and KD.
Yeah. Plus, Thabo, over his career so far, has shown to be a capable three-point shooter.
Absolutely. The 2 years before this were both above 40%.
Yeah.
So even if it wasn't the easiest to be a catch-and-shoot player last year for Thabo, I think that this year he very well could. And at a bare minimum, they got a great perimeter defender on a solid contract.
Yep.
Another, I think, solid contract is Kent Bazemore. I don't expect him to play very much this year. He's only averaging about 9 minutes a game right now. But he's a young-ish, 25-year-old dude who can provide some scrappy and aggressive defense and get out in transition. He did show a bit of improvement in his three-point shot when he was out in LA, shooting 37%, but that was only in 28 games. Sample size, noise, all that stuff is obviously going to occur. So if I'm a Hawks fan, I'm pretty skeptical about any sort of Dylon hot fire claims coming out of the Bazemore camp.
Yeah, another addition that I'm particularly high on was their draft pick in the first round, Adrian Payne from Michigan State. He kind of got knocked for being older because he was a senior coming out.
Because he's a senior, he's obviously a senior citizen.
NBA teams have a very strong bias against age, but he's really got one of the most well-rounded offensive and defensive skill sets of any big in this draft class. And that's going to fit well on a team that seems to love guys like that, as evidenced by Al Horford, Paul Millsap, etc.
Pero Antic, Mike
Scott. Yeah. He's easily one of my favorite players in this draft class. And while the Hawks front court is very crowded right now, I would not be surprised to see Payne earn Coach Bud's trust fairly quickly once he gets back from this plantar fasciitis stuff, which, from personal experience, plantar fasciitis sucks. But once he can get back from that, I have no doubt he'll be able to get Coach Bud's trust and carve out a role in the rotation this year.
Speaking of a guy who was going to get a role in the rotation, Lou Williams had a pretty big role in the rotation last year. He was the sixth on the team in minutes per game, as well as being one of 6 guys who scored in double figures. Basically, if you don't get what I'm getting at here, he was their 6th man.
Yes.
He's a combo guard, capable of breaking down the defense off the bounce. Not necessarily a lights-out shooter, but he can hit the open catch-and-shot opportunity. So far this season, most of the minutes from him are going to Dennis Schroeder. A bit are going to Bazemore. Cephalosha obviously took a couple of them at the 2-guard position. And then Kyle Korver and Damari Carroll are also getting a couple extra minutes per night. So that's where most of those are going. And I think that's about what we're going to see throughout the rest of the year.
Lou Williams might be gone, but the rest of the Hawks are going to be playing games in Atlanta this season.
Yeah.
And they're going to be doing it on a negative rest differential. And rest differential is a stat that we looked at here that's basically just taking all of the road back-to-backs, 4 games in 5 nights, and 3 games in 4 nights that a team plays over the course of the season and compare that to the same numbers for their opponents over the course of the season. And the Hawks have a negative 17 rest differential, which just means over the course of the season, they're going to be less rested than their opponents, which more and more science is coming out that shows not being rested makes your production and your performance suffer. So this could be a negative thing for the Hawks, especially when you factor in some guys have had injury histories in the past.
Yeah, that's a negative thing for the Hawks, like you mentioned. But a positive thing for our team preview podcast is a segment we like to call 5 Questions. It's basically what it sounds like. We ask each other 5 questions that are about things we otherwise might not have been able to get to. So Josh is the first one. Fire away.
Yep. So does this team need upgrades on the bench? And if so, where?
Good question. I think that the team could benefit from a better backup point guard. Of course, they're hoping that Schroeder develops into that. So I'm not saying it necessarily needs to be a personnel upgrade, but maybe a player development upgrade. The team could use some bench rim protection, I think. A guy on the bench they can throw in to, block shots like a Steamsma. Or
sneaky thing here, at least in preseason, and he did this in college too, Adrian Payne can provide some rim protection off the bench for them. He's not the Rudy Gobert type rim protector that you think of when you hear the term rim protector, but he's a guy that might be able to fill that role off the bench.
That'd be really cool. Anytime you get a 3-point rim protector, that's always awesome.
it's catnip to Will and I, 3-point shooting rim protectors.
But I think they could use some of that. But I like a lot of the pieces on their bench. I just think that those are the two big things that they could really benefit from. So for the second question, after an all-star appearance and a likely another strong season from Paul Millsap, are the Hawks going to be able to re-sign him in the offseason?
I think so. We've mentioned before in previous previews that there's a lot of big-name bigs that are going to be on the market this next free agency period. But most of those guys are likely going to re-sign with their current team. So guys like Greg Monroe, like Paul Millsap, might, if they hang out for a little bit, they might get a team that misses out on their top couple of free agent prospects and decides to throw a bunch of money at them.
Yeah.
So I think it's about 50-50-ish that the Hawks can keep him, just because some team is going to have a bunch of cap space, is going to want to use that cap space, and they're not going to get a Marc Gasol or a LaMarcus Aldridge or even a DeAndre Jordan. So they might look into a Greg Monroe or a Paul Millsap type. That said, the Hawks only have about $41 million on the books next year, and the cap's going to be rising. I think the projected cap's about $63 million, so they would be able to bring him back at a salary commensurate with his value. But, I can't really say for sure if he'll be a Hawk after this next season or not, because somebody's going to make him a nice offer.
Yep.
Speaking of nice offers, given that the Hawks, as you mentioned, don't really have a rim-protecting presence at the moment, might the Hawks get some nice offers for either Paul Millsap or Al Horford in exchange for a potential rim protector?
That'd be pretty interesting. And I think that this would be something that the Hawks, as much as I love both of those guys, just given the way that defenses work in this sort of 2.9 style era where, like you mentioned earlier in other team previews, guys don't even really care what their man is doing. It's more about the second line. I think that might be a useful sort of thing for them to maybe look at tweaking their roster with. And it might be, like you mentioned, in free agency. Maybe they make a run at one of the bajillion rim protectors in this up-and-coming free agency class. Maybe it comes through a trade. But I think that if Millsap does decide to walk, a guy like an Omer Asik would be really cool for this team to put next to a guy like Horford, for example. As weird as it is, I don't know. I'm kind of torn, as much as because I like these, like Horford and Millsap are two of my favorite big guys in basketball. But I kind of sneaky like both of them more next to a rim protector like an Asik, just because of how important that is and the fact that both of those guys can provide the spacing necessary to go 4 out.
Yeah.
So with the uncertainty in terms of ownership and the front office kind of being in disarray because racism happened, could this be the year that the Hawks cash in that big trade chip and is named Al Horford, essentially?
I think it might be, but it completely depends on how things progress in terms of the sale of that majority ownership stake. If we see a new ownership group come in, I would say it'd be about 50-50 that Big Al gets moved, simply because he has by far the most trade value on their roster. Millsap's going to be a free agent, so teams aren't going to really want to try to trade for him and then try to convince him to stay. They'd probably rather also not give up assets to get a guy that they could just go after in free agency.
Right.
And while Will and I love Kyle Korver, and we think he's a massively impactful offensive player, he's probably not going to net you the kind of valuable rim protecting presence that Al Horford might. or a top young prospect or draft picks that Horford might.
Yep.
So if a new ownership comes in, they're likely, like we mentioned earlier, to want to put their own stamp on things, and that would probably mean an Al Horford trade, despite Al Horford being a great fit for this organization, a great player, and a great locker room guy. But that also makes him valuable across the league.
Yep.
So for the final question, with all of the aforementioned off-court distractions, can the Hawks stay focused enough to really be one of the top 3 teams in the East that we think they can be?
They can. Will they? That's kind of the question. I mean, the East has gotten better this year, I think, in terms of from 1 through 8. You have Miami now. They're still going to be a thing, I think. That's a good team. You have an improved... You still have Brooklyn might be a thing. You have Charlotte might be a thing. There are other teams. Toronto, yeah. You have Toronto. That's another really solid team. It could go anywhere. 3 through 6 is sort of I don't really know. But I think that the Hawks have the talent. I forgot the Wizards. So 3 through 7. There are a lot of solid sort of 45, 50-ish win teams that could emerge out of the Eastern Conference this year. Atlanta's going to be one of them, most likely. Knock on wood, no major injuries. So I think it could happen. But like we mentioned, there is a lot of uncertainty in the balance, and a lot of this also depends on if a new GM comes up relatively quickly here. That might makes for some big roster changes or even some coaching changes. Who knows what happens?
Yeah. Speaking of who knows what's happens, it's time for that segment in our previews where we discuss our guesses at what's going to happen, otherwise known as our 20-50-80.
Yeah, and if you didn't know it was happening, you need to watch one of our previews, man.
Yeah. And 20 is 20% likely, 50% likely, 80% likely. So it lets us say some crazy stuff that's unlikely to happen, but that we think would be kind of cool, as well as stuff that might or might not happen, and most likely will happen. So we get to cover all the bases of the prediction game here.
Absolutely.
So, Will, why don't you tell us your 20%?
Okay. So it's kind of a bit of a stretch, but I think there's a 20% chance that Jeff Teague, Paul Millsap, and Al Horford all make the All-Star team.
Very stretchy.
It's a bit stretchy. But
20%.
Exactly. Teague's pretty close. If he can drop like 17-7, 17-8, that's fringe. That's the kind of he could get like some of the. That's a fringe.
Horford
sort of.
And Millsap, I think, could easily do it. It's the Teague with Rose back, Rondo back, and Kyle Lowry likely to get an All-Star vote this year after being snubbed last year.
Yeah, I don't think it's the most likely thing to happen, but that's why I said 20%.
Yeah.
I think that there's a 50% chance that Thabo Sefolosha shoots at least 38% from 3 this year.
Yeah.
I'm projecting a comeback year for Thabo, just because that OKC system gets a bit dry in terms of open shot opportunities, and this sort of Spurs East thing that the Hawks have going on right now is literally the opposite of that. Thabo can shoot. We know he can shoot. It's not like he's 50 out there, and it's deteriorating. He had one down year, and he's had plenty of other good years, so I think he bounces back. Mm-hmm. And then I think there's an 80% chance that DeMarre Carroll gets robbed in free agency this offseason. And when I say robbed, I kind of have a very liberal definition of robbed. But I think he's the guy who should be making double figures.
Yeah, he's not getting that.
I know he's not, but he should.
I don't know if he should, but I get your point. My 20% likely is that the Hawks make the Eastern Conference Finals. Yeah. Obviously, that's going to depend on how stable this roster and coaching system is, given the uncertainty in the front office and the ownership, as well as any potential injuries. But I think they have the talent, and they have a great coach in Coach Budenholzer. They could ease, and without Al Horford, arguably their best player, they took the number 1 seed last year to 7 games and had them on the ropes. Yeah. So I think this team is very capable of making it to the Eastern Conference Finals if healthy and if this roster and coaching staff remain in place.
Absolutely.
I think it's 50% likely that the Hawks have home court advantage in the first round. I definitely think they'll be one of the top 4 teams in the East. The only reason it's not a higher percentage likelihood for me is, once again, the aforementioned uncertainty and any injury risks.
Yep.
I think it's 80% likely that the Hawks are going to struggle even more with attendance this year until they get a new ownership in place and a new GM in place, because the Hawks already struggled with attendance. That was part of the reason why Levinson sent that email in the first place. It was trying to come up with ways to improve the attendance and the fan base. And all this racism stuff, all of this uncertainty is not going to help those attendance numbers this year.
No, they're 28th in attendance. This is a good team.
A very good team when healthy, yeah. And they play an exciting style of game.
Yeah, and it went literally Milwaukee, Philly, Atlanta. One of those teams is not like the others.
Yes.
So that's not very good, but is this team going to be good?
If there are no major personnel changes, they will be the dark horse Eastern Conference Finals team to go far in the playoffs this year on the Eastern side, I think.
Absolutely. I agree that they can contend for that Eastern Conference Finals, but I also think that problems with bench depth and the rim protection still not being ideal, it's going to hurt their chances in the postseason, especially when they come up against teams like Cleveland or Chicago. It's going to be kind of rough. Still, one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference, and definitely one of the more exciting teams to watch in the league.
Agreed.
So if you found this video exciting to watch, leave a thumbs up. If you didn't, leave a thumbs down. If your ideas can't be expressed in a simple thumbs up, thumbs down binary, maybe leave a comment down below. Or if you have thoughts on the Hawks and their players. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our channel to watch all of our future videos, as well as maybe sharing this video with some of your friends on Facebook, Twitter, Morse code, carrier pigeon, email.
Especially carrier pigeon.
Carrier pigeon's dope. So I think that's a wrap. Peace out, and thanks a bunch for watching.
Take care.
Bye.